Hey guys, this is Will from LearnChess101.com, and we're going to go over a game today that was just a pretty overall smooth win, and I think there's a lot of value in some of the things that happen here that you can definitely learn some things from. So let's get to it. So we start off, they first move by moving out their pawns. I do the same, and then they do something interesting here. This is a move you'll see a lot. And if you don't know what's happening, it can actually be pretty fatal to what's going on in the game. So what happens here is you'll see they bring out the queen. And a lot of times those not familiar with this, just very without even thinking, I know I used to do this, take this pawn here at g7 and move it to g6. And hoping just that the queen will go away. But what happens is then they move the queen right here to capture this pawn. And then your king's in check, and the thing is, you now just already moved that pawn out. So now they have a clear pathway to not only capture this pawn, but then you're in check, and then they go and capture your rook. And if you're not careful, they might even take your knight too. So the way to counter this, it's actually pretty simple. All you do is just move your knight out right here to protect the pawn. And, whoops, hold on, let me pull that there. I'm not sure what I hit. So you bring your knight out to protect the pawn, and then you'll see right here my opponent brought out their bishop, and at that point you bring out your pawn to get the queen out of there. So then my opponent takes their queen, just brings it back right up towards their king, and I continue on doing my setup. This is my standard setup. I always like to bring my knights out first just to kind of have some more pieces to expand across the board. My opponent then captures my knight. I take their bishop. And we just keep moving out pawns. I'm going to breeze through here. It gets interesting in a couple more moves. So they go and they capture my knight. I capture their bishop. And they just kind of keep moving their pawns out. I'm still doing my setup. You can see neither of us has actually castled yet. Typically, this is right around where I castle. And you'll see I do right there. You always want to make sure you castle as soon as you can. You never want to leave your king just kind of out here in the middle. It just makes it very, very easy to achieve checkmate since your king's in a very vulnerable position. So then my opponent moves out their knight, and I'm still getting everything set up. They castle queenside. Generally speaking, it's recommended to castle opposite queenside. I personally always like to castle opposite queenside, and ever since I started doing that, my game has improved tremendously. I'd say out of every 10 games I currently play on chess.com, I usually win about 7 or 8 out of all those games, 70, 80%, sometimes more. And that was all just from just a couple adjustments I've made. And you'll see here too what happens when you when you castle kingside. Excuse me, when you castle queenside, you're going to see why that can sometimes make it very easy to get captured. So I move my queen out here, and my opponent moves out their knight, and they're still moving their pawns. Opponent moves their queen over there to protect the king, and this is where it gets interesting. So I move the king in check with my queen, and opponent moves the queen there, and I capture the queen. Now, me personally, I typically don't do those types of moves where it's kind of like you just capture a piece, and you'll see they just capture my queen back. But you're going to see exactly why I chose to do that. So I move my pawn up, they capture my pawn, I capture theirs, and this is where all of a sudden, if you notice, the king for my opponent is incredibly vulnerable. King's right here, all their pieces are over on the opposite end of the board, which puts the king again in a very vulnerable position, which is why I did that one queen move, since the queen was really the one piece protecting the king. So that's a big thing about chess too. Just keep that in mind that you always want to be a couple moves ahead. When I moved that queen there, it wasn't just to do it. There was a plan behind it. So now my opponent moves over the rook, kind of seeing that I'm getting my pawn a little bit close to getting promoted. I put the king in check, and then I move my pawn closer. So now they're moving over their knight to kind of free up the rook here, and also, of course, to get the knight a little bit over to where the action's happening. And at that point, I now move my rook up, who's protected by the pawn, putting the king in check, and the king has to move. So then right there, I now get to take the pawn, and you'll see that, of course, they could capture my bishop with the rook, but then in return, I would capture the rook with my rook. And generally speaking, the rook is considered a higher value piece, so it's more likely they're not going to do it, and I just got a free pawn, also making it easier for this pawn to keep moving forward. So as you'll see, they move the rook out of the way, they don't capture my bishop, and I put the king back in check. So now at this point, I move my rook out to protect this pawn and keep it moving forward. And my opponent moves the knight over, and now I bring the pawn one step closer to getting promoted to queen. So my opponent now has basically there's the rook stuck there, since if they move the rook, I'm just going to get a queen, and they'll have to either capture my rook, losing it to this rook, or facing another queen. So now I bring my bishop over here because this knight's just kind of causing trouble for me, and then they capture my bishop. So then I take the knight return, my opponent moves up a pawn, and then that's when I go and just move my rook right here. And if you're wondering why I did that, well, if you'll notice, my opponent now has no choice, essentially, but to either capture my rook or just kind of move this king out of the way and lose a rook anyway. So they go and capture my rook, I get my pawn promoted to queen, and at that point, my opponent chooses to quit the game. So as I said, there's just a couple really good things to take from this. The first being, watch out for that move in the beginning where they move the the queen into that one position, which can potentially cause you to lose a pawn, a rook, and sometimes even a knight. On top of that, always make sure that you have your king protected, because you'll see in this game that my opponent had all of their main pieces on the left side of the board, their king was on the right, and it made it very, very easy to not only get my pawn get my pawn promoted, but to also just achieve checkmate, or essentially just at least get them to resign prior to achieving checkmate a couple more moves. So these are a couple things to watch out for. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section, or you can also email me directly at learnchessonline@gmail.com. And again, this is learnchess101.com. Thank you for watching.